Main focus of the task in this training is as follows. First, before conducting the pressure test with nitrogen, make sure to open all valves. Second, all safety and relief valves should be shut off during the pressure test. Third, during the pressure test, nitrogen should be pressurized safely up to the presented standard pressure to the worker. Fourth, before the evacuation, all sorts of service and solenoid valves should be opened. Fifth, it should be verified whether the vacuum pump can be operated below 1,000 microns. Sixth, for the evacuation test, the evacuation level should be below 1,000 microns within the given time for the task. Seventh, if the vacuum pressure does not be below 1,000 microns, make sure to keep conducting the evacuation task until it reaches the desired state. Eighth, the vacuum gauge should be installed as far away from the vacuum pump as possible. Ninth, the manifold gauge must be adjusted to 0 before using it. 10th, in the case of mixed refrigerant, the liquid type must be charged with the liquid service valve or liquid receiver on the high pressure side as much as the amount of refrigerant to be charged. 11th, when supplementing the refrigerant, it should be charged as liquid type through the low pressure side. 12th, when refilling refrigerant, inject a small amount slowly at intervals to avoid liquid compression. 13th, the loss of refrigerant during manifold gauge removal and non-condensing gas purge shall be minimal. 14th, when injecting refrigerant, all fastening parts, such as manifold gauges, shall be inspected for leakage with a gas detector after tightening and before charging refrigerant. 15th, after completing the refrigerant charging, the leakage test should be conducted to the refrigerant cylinder. Then, the refrigerant cylinder should be capped. 16th, in the case of air conditioners, the amount of refrigerant shall be injected according to the manufacturer's manual, and the normal refrigerator shall be checked with the sight glass for the appropriate amount of refrigerant. Please check the preparations and tools for this training. These are precautions. First, be cautious of the safety because the pressure test uses high pressure. Second, the pressure test shall not exceed the maximum pressure in the specifications of manufactured equipment. Third, make sure to conduct the leakage test before and after the nitrogen pressurization. Fourth, when discharging nitrogen gas, drain it slowly at low pressure and hold the hose end firmly. Fifth, for the evacuation test, do not use the high vacuum hose that is installed to the vacuum pump. Instead of it, use the manifold gauge hose. Sixth, when finishing using the vacuum pump, always close the cap of the connecting valve. Seventh, to maintain the performance of the vacuum pump and extend its life, the method of use and management proposed by the manufacturer shall be followed. Eighth, be careful not to mix non-condensing gas when injecting refrigerant. Ninth, when handling refrigerants, be careful about safety accidents. 10th, make sure not to get burnt from the low temperature of the refrigerant. 11th, make sure to wear a safety gear such as safety goggles, long-sleeved clothes, and leather gloves. Please check what you are going to perform on this task. Pressurizing nitrogen. Nitrogen in the refrigerator recovered shall be pressurized to repair symptoms of lack of refrigerant or non-condensing gas mixing. Before injecting the nitrogen gas, open all valves of the refrigeration system. If a refrigerator that was operating normally has a lack of refrigerant or a mixture of non-condensing gas, it is suspected that the refrigerant is leaking. So, test it with nitrogen gas to find the leakage area. Pressure tests shall be performed simultaneously on both the high and low pressure sides of the refrigerator. Connect the high red pressure hose of manifold gauge to the charging nipple at the high pressure part of the refrigerator. Connect the blue low pressure hose of manifold gauge to the charging nipple at the low pressure part of the refrigeration system. Open the main valve on nitrogen gas cylinder. The nitrogen gas cylinder is high pressured, so always install and use the decompression device regulator valve. Open the high and low pressure valve of the manifold gauge and slowly flow nitrogen into the refrigerator. Nitrogen pressure shall be pressurized to the presented standard pressure given to the worker. Wait until the pressurized high and low pressure in the refrigerator are equalized. When the nitrogen pressure rises to the standard pressure and the high and low pressure are equalized, the valves of the nitrogen container and the manifold gauge should be locked. Using a bubble leakage solution, conduct a leakage test on all areas where the leakage is possible, such as the tightening part of the flare nut and the welding part of the refrigerator. After completing the leak inspection and verification, leave it for a certain period of time to check whether the pressure drops. The standard nitrogen pressure should be maintained for at least 15 minutes. If there is no pressure drop, release nitrogen gas that was pressurized for evacuation in the refrigerator. Disconnect the service hose of the manifold gauge which was connected to the nitrogen container, and slowly discharge the nitrogen gas to low pressure in a safe place and direction. After discharging the pressurized nitrogen safely, conduct the evacuation when pressure gauges on the high pressure and low pressure sides reach zero. Evacuation work on the refrigerator. Before evacuating the refrigerator, check the performance of the vacuum pump and the vacuum gauge. Connect the vacuum gauge directly to the vacuum pump. Operate the vacuum pump and check whether the vacuum level maintains at lower than 1,000 microns. Read the value shown on the vacuum gauge. Check whether the value has dropped below 1,000 microns. After completing the inspection on the vacuum pump and the vacuum gauge, disconnect the manifold gauge and put it away. Connect the manifold gauge hose that is connected to the refrigerator to the vacuum pump. If the nipple connecting the refrigerator to the vacuum pump has a valve core attached, it is recommended to remove the valve core and conduct the evacuation. Removing the valve core widens the flow path of fluid, which is effective in the evacuation work. Connect the hose to the suction side of the refrigerator. Use the hose length as short as possible. If there is a leak in the aged sections or connections, it might be evacuated poorly or take much time. When the connecting rubber packaging of the manifold gauge hose is worn, the evacuation is not properly performed due to leakage, so replace the packaging with a new one. Conduct the evacuation until it reaches the desired evacuation level, checking the vacuum gauge. Using a manifold gauge and the vacuum pump, conduct the evacuation for both high pressure and low pressure parts. If the evacuation level does not change even 30 minutes after starting the evacuation process, you should check for the performance of the vacuum pump or any leakage in the system. In a normal working condition, the evacuation level should reach a certain level 30 minutes after starting the evacuation process. When the degree of vacuum reaches a pressure lower than 1,000 microns, the manifold gauge and the low and high pressure valves should be closed and the vacuum pump should be stopped. At this time, the lower the vacuum level, the better. Do not leave it unattended, since it might exceed 1,000 microns when the vacuum level is less than 1,000 microns for 10 minutes. Charging refrigerant in the refrigerator. After completing the evacuation process, charge the refrigerator with refrigerant. It is important to charge the optimal amount which is required for the refrigerator. Adjust the refrigerant scale to 0. Before the refrigerant charging, place the refrigerant cylinder onto the scale to measure its weight. Connect the manifold gauge to the refrigerant container. When dealing with the refrigerant, be sure to wear a safety gear to prevent some injuries caused by the low temperature of refrigerant. Make sure to wear protective goggles and gloves, and also wear a mask to prevent breathing in some toxic chemicals from the refrigerant. Carry out purge work to remove air from the manifold gauge hose. When all air in the manifold gauge hose is removed, tighten it completely to prevent leakage from the hose connection. Using a gas detector, conduct the leakage test on parts where there could be some leakages, such as the connecting parts at the refrigerant cylinder and the manifold gauge. Open the valve of manifold gauge and start charging the refrigerant. Leakage inspection of connections is carried out using a gas detector even during charging. The refrigerant cylinder should be placed upside down so that liquid refrigerant can be charged first. Confirm the amount of the charged refrigerant while checking the refrigerant scale. The air conditioner that the competitor is dealing with in the video uses the R410A refrigerant. The optimal amount of refrigerant that is required for the system is 1,000 grams. When the refrigerant is charged to the required amount, close the valves of the refrigerant container and manifold gauge. Apply power to the refrigerator and operate the refrigeration system. Be sure to check the rated voltage before connecting power. When the compressor is operated, close the liquid pipe service valve or the valve on the inlet side of the evaporator and open the manifold gauge valve so that all refrigerants in the manifold gauge and hose are inside the unit. During this process, the refrigerant container valve must be closed. Check the low pressure gauge of the manifold gauge to see if there is any remaining refrigerant inside the hose. What we are doing now is to reduce the amount of refrigerant released into the atmosphere when the manifold gauge hose is removed. Close all valves and manifold gauges and remove the charging hose connected to the refrigerator. After completing all tasks, remove all tools that are attached to the equipment. Reassemble the flare nuts or valve parts of the refrigerator that have been separated for nitrogen pressure and refrigerant charging, and fasten the protective cap of the refrigerant container. If the valve core has been removed, assemble it again and remove the valve core detachable valve. Using a gas detector, conduct the leakage test to make sure there is no refrigerant leakage on the assembled points. Check again the key points of the task we've worked on in this training. In this training, we have learned the process 2 to repair the failure of air conditioner. Everybody, thank you for your hard works.